Okay, let's kick things off for the Market Performance and Planning Forum for Q1. My name is Brenda Corona here from the Stakeholder Affairs Group, and today I'll be helping facilitate this call with my event producer, Silas, who is our event producer. And we have a few panelists also who will be helping with their slides. So with that, let's go to the first slide for a few meeting reminders. And as this call is being recorded for informational purposes only, any related transcriptions should not be reprinted. The slides are currently updated and posted on the Market Performance and Planning Forum. And also, we will be having questions on the next slide, if we can go to that, on how to participate for virtual participation. So for those who are on the phone, we encourage you to use #2, but we also have a new icon that is the raise hand icon that's located at a different location. I'll have Silas kind of describe where it is in a few moments. And those who are here, we have a large and mighty group here that might have any questions. Brian, he's here today. Thank you. We also will take questions on the room. But Silas, can you go over those raise hand icon located, where it's located, so we can let the audience know?
Absolutely. When we move to the Q&A, if you would like to enter the verbal queue, you can press the raise hand icon. It is located at the bottom center of your screen to the right of your mute button. It looks like a small hand. Pressing that will indicate that you wish to ask a question, and you will be unmuted by the event producer.
Thank you, Silas. So we can go ahead and kick things off on our agenda. Slide next. Well, before we go to our agenda, this is the objective for today's meeting. It's kind of repetitive from our previous meetings, but this year we're doing 2023 release plans, as well other topics that might be mentioned during the first portion of the market analysis and forecasting team, and also any other timelines that will be discussed in the other portions with Trang Vo as well. But before we begin, we want to go over the agenda that will kind of highlight the timing for each of those topics. So Silas, if you can go to the next slide. Our first group of speakers will have from market analysis and forecasting team. We do have Katie Wilker, Kevin Head, and a few others who will be presenting on those slides. And on about 3 o'clock, we will switch things over to policy update with Jillian, and she will also be virtually participating today. And then lastly, we have a release update with Trang Vo. She will be joining us in person here to give those updates. But there's a lot of slides, so preparing everyone in advance. We have a lot of content to cover, but we will do our very best to pace ourselves. And feel free to use the chat function to submit questions. If you don't want to provide a verbal update, we'll kind of take those offline and answer those questions as we go. But right now, we can go ahead and kick things off for our first speaker. Let's test audio with Katie Wilker for Market Analysis and Forecasting team.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. All right, let's go to the next slide, please. Oh, I think this is not my slide. Is this perhaps? Yeah, let's go one more. All right, awesome. Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katie Wickler. I'm a senior market engineering specialist here at the ISO. Just had a couple of slides to go over some analysis results we wanted to share with the broader group. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So we looked at a correlation analysis regarding spinning reserve bids and a couple other data sets. So, at a high level, our goal here was to explore whether spinning reserve bids had any sort of correlation to either natural gas prices or demand levels. This is something that we discussed sort of tangentially through the day-ahead market enhancements, and this is just sort of an additional analysis we wanted to perform to explore this correlation a bit more. So what we did is we looked at day-ahead spinning reserve bids, and we compared those against the following data sets to see if there was any correlation. So we looked at next day gas prices. We also looked at unadjusted RUC load forecasts mapped by UDC or utility distribution company. The time frame for this was the calendar year 2022, so January through December, and we did exclude self-scheduled spin bids, so we're only looking really at those subset of economic bids submitted to the market. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So here, these are some results we wanted to show. We have commodity natural gas prices versus weighted average spin bid prices. And the way we've broken this down is by season and also by natural gas pricing hub, 4 of the sort of main gas hubs that we see in California. And so, you know, a lot of data going on here, but in general, a couple things to note. First, you can see pretty clearly the range of gas prices for the winter. That's primarily driven by the high gas prices that we observed during the volatility in December of this past year. You also may notice sort of some blockiness on the x-axis. That's sort of inherent to the underlying data set itself, gas prices being sort of traded on a daily level, whereas spin bids can be traded hourly. So a little bit of inherent sort of blockiness in the data there. On the whole, what we see is, you know, not a very strong linear correlation for any of the seasons, maybe somewhat in the summer time frame, but you know, in general, what we're seeing is really a range of spin bid prices from the floor to the ceiling, sort of regardless of gas price level. So not too strong of a linear correlation we can see there. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is showing sort of something similar. Instead of gas prices here, we're looking at RUC load forecast, and this is broken down, again, by season, but also by utility distribution company. And, you know, what we're seeing, again, not really a strong linear correlation. Perhaps more in the summertime, we might see a little bit more of a correlation there, but, you know, on the whole, nothing too strong. You know, seeing again that range of bids from the floor to the ceiling, regardless of load level across seasons and across groupings. If we could go to the next slide. So this is sort of a similar chart here. And what I've done is overlaid the related commodity gas price that was trading for that day and that hour for each of the bids. This is just a subset of the season, so this is actually just showing summer 2022. So a bit of an interesting results here. You know, again, we're seeing potentially some linear relationship as we get into those higher load forecast levels, again, correlating to higher spin bid prices. And in general, perhaps, you know, seeing more of a range of spin bid prices as we get into the higher commodity gas price levels, on, you know, the red dots indicating a higher gas price, the blue dots indicating a lower gas price. But if we go to the next slide, yeah, so, you know, it's interesting to look at sort of how the data maps out visually, but something we wanted to look at was to really get into the numbers and see if we could pin down numerically how much or how little of a correlation existed between these two data sets. So we looked at 2 metrics here. We looked at the Pearson and the Spearman correlation coefficients. Generally, we use these to measure how related 2 data sets may or may not be. So the Pearson coefficient, that's measuring just a pure linear relationship between the 2 data sets. In general, it's best for data that's normally distributed, which was the case for some of these data sets that I was referencing, but not all. The Spearman coefficient, on the other hand, that's measuring a monotonic relationship between the data sets and can be useful for data that's not normally distributed. So that was somewhat helpful for some of the other data sets we looked at. But for both of these coefficients, generally what we expect to see is something between the range of -1 to 1. So 1 is indicating a perfect correlation, negative values are indicating anti-correlation. And generally what we see is that anything above 0.7 or 0.8 indicates a strong correlation between the 2 data sets. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the results of running the Pearson and the Spearman correlation coefficients for the various data sets. There's a lot of numbers here, and I'm not going to get really into the specifics, but what I just wanted to point out is, in general, we're really not seeing very strong results for either of these data sets or correlation coefficients. In general, we're seeing results at or around 0.1, some even less than 0.1 or dipping into the negative range. So in general, these numerical results are sort of substantiating our initial findings from the visual results that there may not be as strong of a correlation between the data sets, at least in this initial analysis that we performed. And I think those were all the slides that I had, so I'd be happy to take any questions if folks have those.
As a reminder to attendees, if you would like to ask a question, you can press the raise hand icon on WebEx located at the bottom center of your screen, or send a question through the chat panel to all panelists. If you are dialed into our phone-only line, please dial #2 to enter the question queue.
Good afternoon, Christopher McLean, staff, California Energy Commission. So for your correlation analyses, were you performing those on sort of the direct price information or the change in prices from whatever sort of granularity or intervals the data represented?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we were performing that. What we were basically doing is taking, for the economic spin bids that were submitted into the market, we were taking sort of a weighted average. So if the bid was submitted at, multiple megawatt breakpoints, we're taking sort of the weighted average of that to sort of boil it down a little bit more concisely to compare hour by hour, if that makes sense.
Okay, and so I think there was some gas price data. Did you actually have gas prices at an hourly?
Right. So yeah, that's a good point. So gas prices are not at an hourly granularity, and if we can go back to I think 3 or 4 slides previously, and because gas prices trade on a daily granularity, we really have one gas price per day, not per hour. And so there's sort of some inherent blockiness in the data by mapping a daily value to something that can be submitted at up to 24 hours of granularity.
Right, I appreciate that, thank you. So then I guess the sort of final question, if you got everything to a daily value and you took deltas across days and then did the correlations against the deltas rather than the prices themselves, I'm wondering if that analysis was performed and or whether or not you're interested in doing it if it hasn't been done.
Yeah, that's not something that we looked at in this round of analysis. I'm not sure what the plans are to sort of dive deeper into this, but that's something we can take back for consideration. And if we do perform another round of this, that might be something to look into.
We do have another question in the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. Hi, this is Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. I have to confess I'm not especially familiar with these indices, the Pearson and the Spearman. Is there a level at which the correlation is considered significant?
Hi, thanks for the question. It seems to sort of vary depending on the source. What I found was generally 0.7 to 0.8 through 1.0 indicated a strong correlation, a significant correlation. Anything below that, maybe like 0.5 to 0.7 was somewhat, moderately strong, and then below that, not very strong or not very significant. So those are sort of generally the thresholds that we were looking at in these, for the context of these numbers.
Okay, thank you.
We do have another question in the chat. Maybe you saw that, but from Carolyn from Energy Management Services. She said if the spin price is not related to load forecast, to what is it correlated?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we were really just looking at these 2 data sets for now. Components or data sets that we we sort of hypothesized might be related. You know, I think there's probably a lot of other pieces of data you could compare to try and substantiate a correlation. You know, these were just two that we sort of thought might be interesting to investigate a little bit further. And, you know, our findings were that the correlation wasn't as strong. And, you know, maybe if we continue to investigate different data sets, there might be different conclusions. But at least for this initial sort of investigation, we were just focusing on those two.
Thank you so much, Katie. I think those are all the questions that we have for now. I do have one question from Alva from PG&E. Let's go ahead and take his question.
This is Elvis Svoboda from PG&E. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, thank you. This is really interesting. One question I had, so you're basically looking at the correlation of bids from a whole population, some of which are actually very aware of gas price because they're fossil plants, natural gas plants, and others of which, like batteries or hydro, might not even be paying attention to gas price. What fraction of spin bids are actually coming from fossil plants out of the whole population?
Hi, Alva. Thanks for the question. Are you referring to the correlation between spin bids and gas prices, or both?
Yeah. I mean, the other one seems like something that everybody would be aware of. Everybody would be aware of load where loads were, and I would think there the issue might just be whether there are particular days when people would feel that they should, you know, increase their bids because of increased load. But on the gas price front, I would think it would be related to how, you know, whether your own costs were actually driven by gas prices would sort of drive whether the spin bids would be showing a correlation.
Right. That's a good point, and I may not have stated that explicitly when I went into this, but for the subset of spin bids versus gas prices, what we ended up doing is really just filtering out all resources that were not, you know, influenced by gas prices. So essentially, we're just looking at the subset of gas resources that have, you know, potential influence from the gas price.
Okay,
you know, really
great.
to sort of hone in on that correlation.
That's very helpful. So then your inference would be that essentially these gas plants, they still can essentially, in a sense, trust the ISO to, based on their energy bids, to award spin based on opportunity cost, and that they don't need to put anything additional in to their spin bids because of higher gas prices. Is that kind of where this analysis would indicate?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I'm not sure, you know, we took it as far as to sort of start drawing conclusions to that extent, but, you know, I think that's an interesting point that could be sort of extrapolated from what we're seeing here.
Great. And then the correlation with load, you were looking at the whole population. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate the interesting work.
Thanks.
Let's go ahead and, Katie, is that the last from your slide? We can go ahead and move on.
Yeah, this was the last slide.
Okay, then we have Kevin Head, our next presenter. Kevin, testing audio. Can you hear us?
Brenda.
Oh, can you go again? We kind of cut off.
Hey, can you hear me? Am I coming through clearly?
Yes, now you are. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Cool. Hi, everyone. Kevin Head. I work with Katie Wickler. I'm also a senior market engineering specialist at the ISO. Doing a quick update on the hybrid phase 2B implementation. So if you could please go to the next slide. So a little history of the Hybrid Resources Initiative. In phase one, we created this co-located model, which provides a little bit of extra market functionality for what we call co-located resources, which is typically a energy storage resource plus a variable energy resource, so solar or wind typically. And in the co-located model, we have two separate resource IDs, but they're sitting behind what we call an aggregate capability constraint, ACC, which is used to limit the combined output of those two resources. In phase two, we created a hybrid resource model, which is just a different way that scheduling coordinators who have these types of arrangements, a VER plus energy storage or that similar setup, to represent those two resources as one resource ID in the market. For phase 2A, we implemented some functionality related to ancillary services and high sustainable limits. For phase 2B, which is the one that went in recently on February 1st, 2023, we created the concept of a hybrid dynamic limit, which I'll explain a little bit of how that works in the next slide. But we also implemented something called a sub-ACC constraint, sub-aggregate capability constraint. And then phase 2C, which is slated for later this year, has not yet been implemented, and that'll affect the RIMS system and allow for some enhancements related to what we call TIGENs. But focusing on 2B, the next slide has sort of a visual representation of how these dynamic limits work. So if you please go to the next slide. So the hybrid dynamic limits are a way that market participants who have these hybrid resources, it allows them to reflect the resource's physical operating characteristics to the market in a more timely basis, and also at a higher level of granularity. And so what I mean by that is, before this functionality was introduced, the two primary ways that a hybrid resource could represent itself to the market, its availability, would be through the submission of bids. You can show your capability or capacity through your bid. And that has to occur 75 minutes before the hour that the market is operating. And then also you could submit an outage card to say that, hey, I can't produce the amount that was reflected in my bid. So that was sort of a cumbersome process. And so the hybrid dynamic limit was introduced to provide a solution to that functionality there. So the way this works is you submit a higher and lower dynamic limit, which conceptually is sort of like our upper and lower economic limits. But these can be submitted on a 5-minute granularity as opposed to bids, which are submitted at an hourly granularity. And it also allows you to submit them much closer to the time that the market is running. You can submit it up to 10 minutes before the market runs. And so this is just a visual representation of one resource's hybrid dynamic limits, which is in blue, and their awards in the RTD market for energy. And you can see the upper blue line earlier in the day is sort of high, and then when the resource starts ramping up, probably assume this is a solar resource, you can see its energy awards increase correspondingly until perhaps the scheduling coordinator wanted to use the solar energy that the VER component of the hybrid resource, they wanted to use that perhaps for on-site charging to charge their hybrid co-located, I don't want to use the word co-located, but the hybrid piece, the LESR, the storage resource. And so you can see around 10 o'clock, the upper dynamic limit starts to decrease, and correspondingly, the energy award also decreases. So I thought it was kind of a good visual illustration of how this functionality can be used. And then, perhaps around 10 or 11 o'clock, the upper dynamic limit was increased, and that allowed the energy awards to increase as well. So that's just sort of a visual explanation of how these hybrid dynamic limits work. The next slide has sort of an average of how we're seeing these hybrids be scheduled in the market. So the chart on the left has the average awards by market. So green is IFM, yellow/orange is the 15-minute market, and the blue is the 5-minute market. And you can see here that the pattern here sort of mirrors the pattern of a VER dispatch, which I have on the top right. And so all three of these charts on the screen here are the hourly average dispatch by in the month of February 2023 after the hybrid 2B phase, hybrid phase 2B initiative was implemented. And I guess I just wanted to show that it seems that these hybrids are being a little bit more closely dispatched like VER resources, which makes sense, and in particular like solar resources. But they do have a little bit of a longer right-hand tail indicating that the on-site charging that happens in the middle of the day is then being used in the later afternoon, evening hours, which all sort of makes sense. And then I've got the energy storage dispatch in the bottom right, just to serve as sort of a contrast to that, which almost shows the opposite pattern here. So yeah, that's all I had for hybrid phase 2B, but happy to answer any questions that folks have.
Thank you, Kevin. So we can go ahead and take a few questions. I did see one in the chat, and it was from CD McLean. It was it possible for slide 9 for the Kaisuta state the total number of both the SPIN certified resources and 2, the subset of gas affected SPIN certified resources.
Might be a question for the slides I went over previously. Unfortunately, I don't have those numbers available, so we'd have to look into that and get back to you.
Are there any questions in the room?
Hi, Kevin. This is Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. I'm referring to your slide comparing the the hybrid resource dispatch with the VER dispatch. It does seem a little counterintuitive to me, because I'd always understood that the kind of purpose of a hybrid resource was to use the on-site variable resource to charge during the day in anticipation of primarily dispatching across the net load peak hours at night. And the fact that it seems to correlate more to a traditional solar dispatch, though, as you pointed out, there is some tail to it. I see that. But any comment on that? Did you find this somewhat counterintuitive?
It's an interesting point. It might be reflective of the time of year that we're in. We might see this pattern shift over time in the summertime in particular. If the event producer wouldn't mind going to the previous slide, I can, maybe read some tea leaves through the upper dynamic limit here. In the morning time, the late morning, you can see that they've lowered their dynamic limit down. And then, in the middle of the day, perhaps they have their on-site solar fully charged. So then they say, okay, I'm ready to discharge this into the market or offer it into the market. And then maybe, through the energy schedules that they received in the middle of the day, they realized, hey, we might want to top this storage resource back up to close to a full state of charge and use that in the afternoon or the evening net load peak hours. So hard to say exactly, but yeah, it's an interesting observation.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I agree. The the graph that you have, the hybrid dispatch is really interesting, the three markets. Maybe if you present this again in the future, you could overlay price on that so we get a sense of how the resources responding to price.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks.
Can you go ahead and let's go ahead and call on the first two hands raised. We have Alva. Let's unmute your line. He's from PG&E. Go ahead.
I two things. One was just a comment on what Brian was just raising, which is I think it would be useful to know what you're looking at pure hybrids as an average kind of a combination of storage and solar. How much is storage and how much is solar? Because if the storage is relatively small as a proportion of the resource capability, you wouldn't see a very strong, especially in looking at average behavior, you might not see a strong kind of indication of that dispatch that I agree is what we would expect. But if they're essentially roughly equal, then it is a very surprising result, even I think in this time of year. So it would be good to know what just on an average basis, how much of that capacity is actually battery capacity versus solar. The other question I had was, and I really appreciate your putting this together, Kevin, is are there any pure hybrids that are currently able to provide ancillary services?
I'm not sure the answer to that.
Okay, great. I'm interested in that question because I'm just what you're showing raised a question in my mind about how the dynamic limit tool is used for hybrids that are certified to provide ancillary services. So just wanted to put that question in the parking lot and maybe see if there were a way of getting an answer to that. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Al.
And Kevin, we do have one more question. Raul from AES. Let's go ahead and get his question.
Can someone confirm you can hear me?
Hi, Raul. Yep, you're a little faint, but you're coming in.
Yeah, give me 1 second. So do you mind going to the next slide? I think it's page 18. Sorry, page 18. I think that's where you have the profile for, yeah, this one. So few questions on that. So I'm assuming hybrid resources are a combination of solar plus storage. And in this chart, all of the dispatch is positive. Is that because all of them are not grid charging, or somehow the chart does not show if they would be charging from the grid?
So it's hard to say whether there were any charging awards during this period because I'm just showing the average. So none of them dip down, but this is, the sum of, in the ballpark of 20 hybrid resources. So it's possible that some individual resources were charging, but that wouldn't show up. This is showing the net award rather than, gross in either direction.
And do you know what's the period for the data on this chart?
Yeah, it's February 2023.
It's for the entire month, right? Okay. And yeah, just some observations that at least on average, the IFM seems to be following a trend of continuous dispatch. I'm not, because ideally, if I look at the storage chart, 15 through 21 is where storage tend to discharge, and assuming that's the period with the highest price, we are not seeing that. So, yeah, I think I have more questions than thoughts at this point, but yeah, it may be useful if you can split the chart into showing positive and negative. That will help to understand if there is grid charging.
Yeah, I think I can add that if we present this data again.
Okay. Thank you.
We do have
Thanks,
one
Will.
more question. Oh, yeah. Kevin, there's another question. Chris Devon from
Yeah, go ahead.
CES. Let's go ahead.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep, now
Sorry
we
about
can.
that. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, Chris Devon, Customized Energy Solutions. So I just wanted to weigh in here a little bit and say, I think that Alva had a good suggestion, and also Rahul, on the sizing of the underlying units. I think the components, I mean, some of this might make a lot more sense if it's a lot of storage, and I think that's what they are more so than storage. So that would be awesome if we could get a little bit more insight into that part of this, the breakdown there, and pricing suggestions as well from earlier from Brian. But I did want to just weigh in because I think my understanding on that question that Alva had about if there are any of these hybrid resources being certified for regulation is that the CAISO does certify it, but just for the battery storage component part of it and not for the VER component part. So I just wanted to mention that was my understanding and see if there, the CAISO could maybe look into that and confirm. And then the other part, just kind of related to that, is that there were some projects that were being worked on at CAISO about how eventually having VERs provide regulation or provide other ancillary services, and that there was some market design features used in the forecast and everything, that pretty complex stuff that caused it to be a little bit difficult for them to actually do that, that we were working on there for a while. And I just wanted to see if there's any updates on those kind of internal projects, or if there's any plans for in the future for like operating changes or market design changes that might be part of those kind of policies where the CAISO allows for VERs to provide those like according to the policies, but the market design kind of isn't up to the level of being able to allow for that to actually occur. So any comments on that? If you guys have been working on that or have any plans for any of that, would be helpful. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah, this is Abhishek here. Yeah, so we don't know yet as of now. I mean, we have been analyzing this, and I think the comments are pretty good. We can look into it, but from the policy perspective, we don't know where those are. We can get back to you on that. I don't have the answer to that right now. We can look at it.
Thanks, Abhishek.
We good? Okay. Okay, so proceeding from the hybrid, we can change of topics. We can just provide what the CRR update is, and these are the updates that we have been providing in previous MPPF as well. These are just the performance of congestion revenue rights and how it has been performing. Back in 2019, we changed the policy from full funding to partial funding, and basically we have been tracking the performance of congestion revenue rights for some time, and this is just an incremental update of what for the last 2 or 3 months. So let me proceed with it. So this chart basically, it gives you the CRR, the congestion revenue rights settlement perspective of how the different perspective that goes into the CRR settlement. It shows the CRR notional value, basically what they would have received in case of a full funding. That is shown in a green bar. It also shows the CRR deficit, basically the deficiency that have received from a constraint to constraint basis. It also shows the CRR payment. Basically, the CRR payment, adjusted payment, is whatever you would have received after all the adjustments that you have done. Basically, the notional minus the deficit is basically the adjusted payment that the CRR holders would have received. Also, it shows a smaller portion, a very small portion of the CRR surplus. So the surplus, there is a new, obviously, there is a feature of a CRR surplus as well after we change the policy. The surplus and the deficit, they don't net each other. It's just on the constraint by constraint basis. So if it's on a different constraint, the surplus is on a different constraint, it would not net each other. And then also it shows basically the whatever the allocation to the measured demand is, that is the surplus plus all the auction revenues that we have received from the CRR market is allocated to the measured demand. And from this, basically this chart that you can see that during the summer months, obviously there's a lot of congestion, the system conditions have changed, and because of that, you can see that the CRR settlement was very high during those months. But as we go into the winter months, it has been a lot lower, as you can see from the chart. Okay, so this is a different variation of how you look at the CRR performance. This chart basically tells you, it's just a different angle of how you look at it. This is basically a comparison of what would be the CRR settlement, the CRR payment allocated to measured demand, with or without the pro rata funding. So the green bars that are shown is basically what we would have done if we had not implemented. Basically, this is the counterfactual analysis that we have done if we didn't have the pro rata funding, and that is shown in the green bar. At the same time, the blue bar is basically the actual settlement, the congestion revenue rights settlement that is allocated to measured demand, and this includes the auction revenues as well. So you can see from this chart basically that obviously it has been revenue adequate for almost all the months, and it fares very well looking at the blue chart, that there is a fair bit of comparison and the fair is divergent during the summer months, but obviously the green bar is decreasing as well. Obviously it depends on, obviously there are many factors that go in, depends on the congestion and the factors that goes in, but just giving a different angle of the comparison width of the pro rata funding in this particular chart. This chart we have been discussing since we've changed the policy. We have been discussing in several forums and several MPPF. Basically, this shows the auction efficiency. What it means is that the gray bars in this chart is representative of how many auction revenues that we collect in the CRR market. It could be from generators, LSCs, everyone. These are the total auction revenues that we get on the CRR market month to month. And it is comparing that with the pro rata adjusted CRR payments that we have seen. We've discussed that before. Those are the adjusted CRR payments that are given to the CRR holders. So basically that will tell you what the auction efficiency is. We've analyzed this in detail previously as well. This is just giving you a comparison of how the auction efficiency ratio is comparing. The ratio is basically telling the ratio between the auction revenues and the CRR payments. That is shown in the purple bar. In an ideal situation, I mean, both the auction revenues and the CRR payments should have been equal, or should have been at the 100% ratio, that for whatever collected CRR payment, for every $1 of CRR payment collected, what is the auction revenues that they had to pay for? If it shows a 75%, so every $1 of CRR payment that they get, basically in the last few months, they had to pay about 75 to 80 cents of auction revenues. That is what the comparison it is showing. I mean, obviously, in the summer months, it will change month to month because of the volatile condition, because of the summer condition, the congestion pattern and system conditions. But in an ideal situation, if it is closer to the 100% ratio, that means for every dollar payment that they're getting, they're paying $1 in the auction revenues. This chart basically tells, this is another just telling you what the total adjusted payments were throughout for each month starting from January 2019. Just gives you a different variations of how the monthly CRR payments have been paid. Again, there were in the summer months, it will be it was very high because of the congestion pattern that we have seen. But as we go into the winter months, it has decreased in the last 2 or 3 months. And just wanted to show a trend that the pattern has been in a decreasing trend. So I can pause over here and I can see if there are any questions that we have already discussed.
Silas, is there any questions in the phone line?
There are currently no questions on the phone queue.
Okay, let's proceed. So this is one topic, the offset revenue impact. Basically, we discussed this in the final proposal that we had mentioned. Basically, this term, the offset revenue impact, and we have seen through our analysis for some time that there have been instances where we have seen that the offset revenues have been greater than the notional revenues, and that is what we call as a settlement reversal. That we have seen instances where on constraint by constraint basis, the offset revenues has been greater than the notional revenues. So we wanted to see what the impact that we have seen across in the last 1 year to see what kind of impact do we see in this case. So what we did in this case is we have looked at all the instances for a constraints where the offset revenue has been greater than notional revenues and basically apply an historical percentage of offsets. Basically, for each constraint, there would be an historical percentage of on offsets for the same constraint. And we would apply those historical percentages to see what kind of an impact do we see on constraint to constraint basis. Is it a significant amount of impact that we see, and how and what kind of constraint it's concentrated on? Is it on a more lower KV level constraints, or is it spread out everywhere? And that is what the idea of this analysis was. To give you an example, what is an offset revenue impact? I've put out an example what it means that if you have a notional revenue on a constraint, just one constraint for 1 hour, if the notional revenue for that constraint is $1,000 for an SC, they are paid $1,000. The offset revenue is basically what happens is that because of the settlement reversal, they get charged $1,600 for that constraint for that hour. That means that they are charged more than what they have received in this particular case. So that is what we're trying to see. Now, on a historical basis, what would be the ideal scenario for this constraint? What would be the offset? In what range would it be the case? That is based on the historical percentages that we have seen. And for this example, we have just used as a $400 as an example, that if on a historical basis, they would have charged only $400, then basically what it means that the offset revenue impact is $1,200. That means they were in excess on what they were actually being charged. Just to see what the impact is, that's it, based on the historical percentage. So based on that calculation, what we've seen is this, we did this for the last, starting from January 2020, going back to January 2022, February 2023, we wanted to see what kind of constraints are impacted. And generally speaking, I think they have been impacted more on the lower KV at the 115 KV level constraints. It has been spread out. There have been 60 to 70 kV constraints, flow gates that have been impacted by that as well. But when you see the last, and obviously, right, I mean, you see during the summer months, it was a much higher impact that we have seen, and we are looking into it more closely. We are analyzing it more closely, these issues, and we are diving into it. but just wanted to give you what the starting step of these analysis are. So this is the first step of what the impact is and how we are trying to look into it. But in the last 4 or 5 months, we've seen that it has been pretty small, the impact of this one. Going back basically just gives you by constraint basis, these two charts. By constraint basis, what is the notional and the offset revenue by constraint for January 2023. As you can see, it has been spread out amongst many constraints. There have been these outage patterns that we have seen, and because of the outage patterns, there are specific constraints that are binding in the day ahead market, and because of that, you see that impact on in the notional amount and the offset revenues as well. So this is basically just comparison of the notional and the offset for January. And similarly, we have this for the February 2023 as well, comparing the notional revenues by constraint and the offset revenues, the offset deficit basically by constraint. There have been these outage patterns that we have seen, so a particular constraint that might be an outage for about 4 or 5 days in between, and that you might see a direct correlation that might be impacting the notional amount and the deficit amount in that purposes. So this was just what we've looked into the performance of the congestion revenue rights. What we are trying to do is currently we already had a stakeholder proposal call that we did back in January. We had the call and we completed the stakeholder proposal basically to address the shift factor threshold that would be applied to the aggregated location, basically to the D labs and to the trading hubs. We are taking that proposal and we are going to the Board of Governors for the March meeting for approval. That'll be the next step that we have. And at the same time, we are looking into it, whether we can apply these shift factor thresholds for inter-tie locations as well. Obviously, Malin, Palawadi, it does have a significant impact to these ones. We are currently looking into, we are currently analyzing it. And we'll definitely provide more updates in the next in the future MPPF meetings of where those are. But at the same time, we are analyzing these settlement reversal that we call about, where the offset revenues are greater than the notional. We are looking into it more in detail, and probably we'll update these findings and update these analysis as we proceed in the next MPPF as well. So these are just the ongoing efforts that we have from the congestion revenue rights. Any questions that we have?
Questions in queue?
There are currently no questions on the phone queue.
We do have one in the floor.
Good afternoon. Thanks for the analysis, Abhishek. Christopher McLean, staff, California Energy Commission. With respect to the shift factor, in particular relating to the CRRs, is that in the CRR network model only, or would it be reflected across sort of all network models that are supporting market functions?
Yeah, it'll be reflected in the day ahead and the real time market.
Okay.
So it'll be impacted to both of the markets.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. It's strange to be standing here in the office and discuss a variety of topics that we have prepared for today. The next topic is regarding the events that we experience. Okay, let me change topics then. As I was indicating, we experienced certain events in the late 2022 regarding the gas dynamics. It was not specific to the CAISO electric system. It was more spread across the West. And obviously because the CAISO system still relies on about 50% of the generation based on gas resources, the implications of the gas dynamics have a straightforward impact on the electric market. We start by looking into the trends of the gas prices. We have different fuel regions based on different hubs that are utilized for pricing the gas conditions. We have typical hub prices in the north for PG&E, in the south, Kerr River, Local City Gate, El Paso. And the two main ones that come into different fuel regions in the CAISO system are the PG&E City Gate and the SoCal City Gate. And these are reflected here. And the view is going back all the way to January 20. And I would say somewhere in the summer of 2020, we start to see a steady and increasing trend of gas prices. And typically we also see spikes of gas during the winter conditions when gas is high, such as those experienced in the February of 2021, when we saw record high prices in over $100 MMBTU. After that, we continue to see a steady increasing high prices in the range of $5 to $10 per MMBTU. And the point of relevance here is effectively what happens after the Thanksgiving period. We could see gas prices not only in these two main hubs, but across the West, indeed, reaching pretty quickly prices in the range of $40, $50 per mm. It's not unusual to start to see these prices. The usual component here is how sustained they were, because it was not just for 1 or 2 days, it was sustained for basically a month. There were different levels of prices, but you can see graphically how sustained these prices were across the main hubs in the CAISO system. There has been a lot of ink about the reasons for those prices, why they were so sustained. There are elements discussing about the extreme cold weather that puts more pressure for the demand of gas, a higher demand for generation based on gas, and the cold weather coming sooner than expected. Then we have utilized certain level of inventory to meet the high demand of the summer. So we came with lower inventories. There was piping work across the West, the gas inventory that was available. All these are elements that may explain to some extent the volatility of the prices. Yes, the CAISO don't have all the information, all the data, able to assess the price fundamentals, the price formation of that could explain this level of prices. What we do see is the effects that those have in our markets. This is a different view, more specific to the period in discussion, covering November, December, and January. We can see that the severity of the volatility was experienced through December, reaching prices of about $55 per MMBTU. You can see the prices are not just concentrated in the CAISO hubs, but also across different hubs in the West. There is a dotted line there as a reference for the Henry Hub. That is a very liquid and good reference for prices beyond the West, just to serve as a reference how the other prices could be developing. And that gives you a good perspective how diverging was the set of prices experienced in the West. And when we look at the consequences of that, there are different dimensions to the impact. One obviously is going to impact the prices because we're going to be clearing generation based on the gas that is going to be more expensive. That is may potentially displacing some other type of generation, or other generation, the other way around. Other generation may be displacing that expensive gas. But there were different dynamics. And when we look at overall the gas burn, based on how much generation was dispatched from the electric market, we didn't see a dramatic increase in the gas burn. There was an increase relative to December 2021. There is another metric in the report that we posted, where you can see that there is a small increase of gas burn relative to the December. But still, when you see the trend between November, December, and previous year, they are somehow in the typical range of gas burn. And the dotted line on the top is just a reference for the average demand that we have for the electric system. So even the demand was not dramatic previous year. How do we internalize the dynamics of the gas market in electric system? Well, it comes through the bids. We have gas resources that participate in the market as components: minimum load cost, startup cost, transition cost, variable operational range, and bids. And this illustration shows the composition of the bid stack for gas resources organized by price range. You can see early in November, majority of the volume of the bids coming into the system from gas resources was concentrated in the section in blue for prices very typical range of $50, $100 out. As we start going through the end of the month, we can see how dramatically cheap bids from blue transition into darker color, reflecting the higher bid price. Translates in from blue into purple and then into red, reflecting that bids are just increasing, reflecting prices. Reach the middle of December, around December 2022, you can see how dramatic that change is. Basically, the cheap bids below by bids higher end of the spectrum. As we get out of the December time frame, we are coming back to a more typical range where we have lower prices, but still significantly higher than what we observed in November. When we can look at one specific hour just to see the composition of the supply stack. This is color coded by the type of generator, just to have the reference how the gas pool is relative to the rest of the supply stack. You can see that the gas resources that are in this green color takes much of the space, and they are in the space of expensive prices, over $250 most of the volume. And there are other resources that inherently may also have a secondary implication of the gas prices, because there may be some opportunity cost, and therefore these prices may also reflect some higher condition. Another dynamic that happened during this time is the trend of the intertie schedules, specifically the imports. And as we get into the most critical period of mid-December, we also saw a steep decline in the volume of interties coming as imports into the system. Not the amount of imports cleared, but the amount of imports bid into the system. We have just less capacity bid into the system for resources. There has been different outlets indicating the dynamics over there, that there were obviously some constraints of generation in the West that required that type of supply to stay local. There may be other conditions that there was higher demand and therefore it was meeting all needs. And that is the reality, that in addition to having more expensive gas generation, we have less imports, and that really create a very tight condition in the sense of prices for the market. All these bring us to how the prices, the electric prices, performed during this period. This is the similar trend for gas prices overlapping the trend of electric prices. The electric prices are with the shaded area in blue. The line trends are reflecting the gas prices. You can see that there is, most of the time, a very good correlation, and that correlation holds true for the period of December, January, when you see that prices increasing for gas and correspondingly the electric prices go up. There are some inherent differences where you don't see that strong correlation, and that is expected. For instance, if you go back to the previous peak for electric prices, the summer of 2022 heat wave, you can see that on average these prices were around $300, while the gas prices in the lines below kind of stay flat. That is not because of the gas conditions or because of the gas prices. That was because we were dealing with the high demand system conditions of the electric system. And the same is going to happen when you go back to the September 2021, September 2020, when inherent tight supply conditions in the electric sector, regardless of the gas price level, may tend to have higher electric prices. But the point here, to stay on focus, is that there is a strong correlation of the electric prices clearing at high levels based on the correspondingly high gas prices. If we look at historical electric prices for the CAISO, these are organized by market. We look at the last 3 years. We can see that the prices observed for December 2022 are about 5 times higher than what we saw in the previous December and highest, at least for the historical period that we observe. And as we get out of December into the January timeframe, these prices subside, but still they were relatively high relative to historical levels. Another dynamic that we also track, because it's also an input into some logic that we have in the electric market, is the bilateral power prices. We utilize certain bilateral power prices for specific hubs in the West, including the Mid-Sea Point, the Palo Verde, the Mid. And you can see that they kind of following similar trend to what we observe for gas prices and for CAISO internal prices. All this is indeed reflecting kind of the same dynamic of tight conditions and volatility in the prices in the West. The last component to see the implications of these gas dynamics into the electric system has to do, at the end of the day, with the wholesale cost. We have higher prices, we still have to clear demand. Obviously, during the winter time, the demand level is relatively modest in comparison to the summer. But once you factor in that level of demand against these extreme sustained high prices, what you see here is the net effect that is reflected in the wholesale cost of the CAISO markets. Here you have a comparison for 5 years. Each bar stands for a different year. It's organized for the 12 months of the year. And if we look at in the far right, we have the comparison of the last 5 Decembers with the highest value belonging to the December 2022. We're talking about a wholesale cost overall about $4.6 billion. For typical standards, if you take the previous 4 years in the lighter blue bars for December, you can see that the highest was the previous year, and it may have been about $1.1 billion. So we're talking about at least $3 billion of incremental cost. Obviously, there is no precise science to know what the right prices should have been in December 2020. You can just make a reference of what was the previous month or the previous year, but conditions are different. So it's a very simplistic way to get a sense how more expensive that was relative to historical standards. And that means once we factor in these gas prices, the overall effect was an additional $3 billion cost in December and about $1 billion in January. After January, prices trended down. Indeed, in early February, we saw prices in the range of $4 per MMBTU. Right now, I believe they are in the range of $10 per MMBTU. They're still relatively high to what used to be historical standards, anywhere between $3 and $5 per MMBTU. One of the efforts that we have taken for a few years, all this started since early 2015 or 16 was to ensure that the CAISO markets have the mechanisms to allow resources to recover their fuel costs. We ran through a series of initiatives, enhancements to ensure that there are tools and mechanisms in the market for the participants to utilize to reflect those gas prices. We ended up with this complicated policy initiative that was labeled as CCDEVI, the Commitment Cost and Default Energy Bid Enhancements. And that is the last piece of the puzzle to give tools to resources to factor in the dynamics of the gas prices. Naturally, when you see this high volatility of the gas market, we would expect that there will be, as a consequence, more activity by participants submitting these requests in the system. This summarizes the frequency, how many cases of requests we got during this period to be able to process, to reflect more accurately the gas dynamics in the electric system. These are not that many, but still, we did observe some level of activity in this utilization of the tool. Okay, I have no idea if there are any questions, so let me know if we have any.
Stylist, do we have any questions in the phone line? Oh, do we? I don't see any.
We have one in.
Oh, yes, Brian.
Hi, Guillermo. Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. The graph on slide 40 is interesting, the reference level change requests. Maybe you're still within the period and they aren't due yet, but has the ISO encountered any market participants filing at FERC for unrecovered cost as a result of the gas price spikes over this period of time?
Not for this period. I would say that it's still relatively early in the process, so we haven't seen what. I'm sorry, I'm so used to just. I tend to forget the in person.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Guillermo. Christopher McLean, staff, California Energy Commission. Somewhat related to Brian's question, obviously this stands a chance of having some credit impacts. Has the ISO been sort of monitoring credit situations of market participants in the face of these increased costs?
Yes, I can elaborate a little bit on that. When we face this type of activities, we actually have some internal efforts to keep track of what's going on and how things are developing. One of those is closely monitoring the collateral from participants, ensure that they are properly collateralized and sufficient credit. So we have a specific team in the CAISO that tracks that. There were some calls, but nothing extraordinary that could serve.
Excellent, thank you. Just related to gas prices and transparency and information, on OASIS, there's an index report for fuel prices. It lists some 166 different fuel regions. How might market participants understand what those mean with respect to nodes or other things about the ISO markets?
Sure. I would say that is the price of flexibility. And what we have done is that there was part of this series of enhancements that we pursued years back required that we develop specific fuel regions to accommodate specific nuances on different resources. Different resources may have still the reference to the same fuel region, like local city gate, right? But they may be facing different implications for transportation cost, for tax implications. Therefore, we have been very tailored to accommodate these requests to ensure that they properly reflect the cost of their procurement. And that is effectively the reason why we have so many fuel regions, because they are going to be as many as resources you may have just to accommodate the nuances of their cost. Now, the naming of the fuel regions in OASIS is not very intuitive, and recognize that. There is a translation, there is a mapping that we have in the business practice manual, where you can correlate what fuel name in OASIS translates into a more practical name. So I would refer to that mapping. Let me move on, changing topics. There is an area that we have been looking obviously, we take very seriously reliability implications in the operation of the system. We run a market to be able to procure for those services, to match the system through the market as much as we can, ensure that we create the price signals, the incentives through the market for a reliable and efficient operation. One of those reliability services is the regulation market. And there is a requirement to have regulation in the system, either in the upward or downward direction, have some logic to determine the requirements. We put those into the market, we clear the market, what resources are going to be carrying that regulation. And once those resources get awarded regulation, the expectation is that they make themselves available. There is a way how they can get under control to be available to AGC. And by the time they are entering into the period that they are carrying the regulation, we are expecting that they are on control, so the AGC from the CAISO can start sending these pulses of follow the instruction. Historically, we have seen some cases across the different technologies where there are some deviations, some lagging to follow instructions. We have a process in place, a mechanism, a compliance process to follow on these instances. We have specific measures and procedures. But now that we are entering into a quite dynamic paradigm of the system with all these new technologies, this becomes even more critical to ensure that the CAISO is getting the services that through the market. There are different ways to see this information. And one of the interesting dynamics that we have seen for at least 1 year is that with the quick and fast, with the quick and deep penetration of the storage resources, the dynamic of the regulation market has changed. We can see a very typical day that the majority of the regulation procurement is coming from storage resources. If eventually there is a portion of that regulation not being available to the market, we are missing have that capacity that is supposed to be available for the reliable operation of the system. As of now, you can see that storage resources carry a significant portion of the regulation for both up and down. It's critical to ensure that that capacity eventually is under control of the CAISO to be able to consume the signal. We have a couple of trends just to start the discussion, and we will continue to track this more closely. We are doing that internally, but just to have the transparency and the discussion with the market. We're tracking how frequently resources that are awarded and are expected to carry regulation get actually under control. They put themselves on control to allow the CAISO to basically send the AGC signal and be able to follow that signal. We are not talking about even the case where they are on control and whether they follow or not the signal. It's whether they are on control to be able to follow the signal. They are on control and for some reason they may not be able to precisely follow the signal. That is one type of discussion. But not be even able to be on control is kind of a different type of challenge here. So this metric is specific to those that were awarded regulation and were not put on control to be able to follow the signal. And this is a simple metric of the frequency of the 5-minute intervals in which no matter what resources, no matter what time of the day, they were awarded regulation, but they were not put effectively, we could not send them an AGC signal to follow. And you can see that it's in the range of, on average, I would say it's about 8% of the time where those resources carrying regulation are not on control. And obviously, being not on control means operations doesn't have extended amount of regulation to rely on to balance the system on the second granularity. This is a different way to see it, just organized by different scaling coordinators, and you can see there are different ranges of the frequency in which the resources are on control. And we can do that for regulation up, for regulation down. We can try to make a metric consolidated for both directions. There are different ways and angles to see this metric, but the point here is that we do see cases in which, for whatever reason, there are resources that, even though they got awarded regulation, they are not putting the unit on control to be able to receive the AGC signal. And that is something that We are following resources, making sure that we understand the complications, whether we have an issue on our end that for whatever reason is not properly communicated to them, or whether there are other limitations in the instructions that we are awarding such that they are not feasible to follow. So there is a lot of work still to be done to really understand the drivers for this dynamic that we see. This is the same information for regulation down. Let me pause. Questions?
Question from Callie Wells. Let's get her first. Okay, let's go get it. Go ahead,
Hey,
Callie.
Guillermo, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. Can you hear me okay? My audio's been kind of breaking in and out.
I can hear you very well.
All right, great. A couple questions. I guess one is more, I just want to make sure I understand your axes here on the charts, either one of them. So when you say percentage of RTD intervals, are you saying is the interval included here if at least one resource providing regulations not on AGC control, or is it more that for every single 5-minute interval, a resource is awarded AGC? So is it more of a percentage of resource intervals, or just at least one resource does not flip over to AGC, that one interval is included?
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Let me expand. This is the total summation of intervals across all resources. So if you have 10 resources and each one of them didn't put on control for one interval for a period of 1 hour when they carry regulation, that would be 10 resources times 12 intervals, that would be the total. And then you calculate the ones that they were not on control, that would be 10 resources for one interval, and then you can get the percentage. So it's the summation over all resources for all intervals.
Okay, that's what I was assuming, but appreciate you confirming that. And my second question is, do you have a sense of what percentage of the total regulation requirement these resources are representing? Is it a large percentage, or are they procuring maybe a small portion of the overall requirement? Just trying to get an idea of the magnitude of the issue in terms of megawatts.
Yeah, and we have some metrics, and we were not able to put them here, but I commit to have those moving forward so you can get the sense of the size of the implication.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Guillermo. Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. Slide 44. I don't want to draw an inference that's not there. You said that a significant part of your regulation comes from batteries resources. And then you've got, I assume that what's shown on slide 44 is from all resources, not just battery resources.
It's only storage resources.
It's only storage resources. Okay, that's interesting. That leads me to a couple more questions. Does the ISO no pay when a resource doesn't go on control and they've been awarded regulation?
There is some logic that we are actually in, because we have a whole process, pay for performance, we have a whole process to follow up for compliance, certain level of performance. So all this plays well. The complexity here is that these metrics are kind of bases summarized over a certain of time, so it may not be that fine to make a significant incentive.
Understood. Last question. Does the ISO account for this historical non-performance when it procures regulation? In other words, does it buy more regulation anticipating that a significant percentage won't go on control?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting question. Let me think loudly here, because our regulation requirement is determined based on the utilization that we had previously, historically. That utilization effectively tells us how much we actually needed and how much actually we deploy. So I believe there would be an inherent feedback that have that this performance, it may fit in implicitly in requirement. But that's a very subtle nuance. Yeah, I would like to face more of that.
Thanks much, Guillermo.
Yeah.
Thanks for this work, Guillermo. Thanks to you and your team. Christopher McLean, staff, California Energy Commission. on this slide here, I think we determined, thanks to Brian, that this is sort of a subset, the storage resource subset of resources providing upward reg. I think it'd be interesting to see sort of the complement. So what's the rest of the reg fleet looking like? And sharing that information would be helpful. Again, applaud the efforts, and it's good work.
Yeah, I think for completeness, it's a good call. I would characterize a little bit how the logic play here, because historically, at the last few months, we know that sometimes 100% of the regulation is from storage resources. There will be no missing piece on that sense. But yeah, I take the point. So we.
I have one question from David Brown from CDWR. He asked if can an SC request their AGC percentage? If so, how? Thank you.
I will have to follow up on that question. I don't have the answers to answer that on the spot. I think we have one more question. I think you have to keep the mic.
Well, that's what you got a small subset of folks here. I'm pleased to be disproportionately involved. Guillermo, I'm sorry, I missed it if you said it. On page 45, is that also just storage resources?
Everything of this section.
Everything in there. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much.
We have one for both. Okay, let me move now into the next topic, and we will be sharing the material for this portion. Let me start just with one introduction before I hand it over to the casting team. We went a long way to implement what we currently have in production, named the flexible ramping product enhancement. That was an ordeal that started back in 2019 when we do comprehensive analysis of the efficiency and performance of the flexible ramping product. The outcome of that was the initiation of a policy initiative to go after improvements for the FRP. And the end result of that policy was the change of paradigm, going from system-wide EA level procurement into what we call the nodal FRP. That required an entire redesign of the functionality that we have in the market. No wonder why it took us that long to get it implemented eventually. And there were at least two significant changes that come together. One is rightly the formulation that goes from the system-wide balancing area-wise into a nodal program. That's happening in the guts of the market optimization, the market design. Together with that, we follow up and we piggyback on this effort to also pursue the improvements regarding the calculation of the requirements of the uncertainty. That is a piece that was not part of the stakeholder discussion. We simply leverage on that process to bring this piece together. It makes sense to bring it together because it was touching the same area of the market. And separate from this policy design, we have this enhancement to really go in a more sophisticated fashion in the calculation of the FRP requirements, the uncertainty requirement. We redesigned not only the calculation, but we came with a new box of the application to be able to host that calculation. It was a significant effort because it touched every single system that we have in the market application, in addition to building up a brand new application. We have all this in place now, and effective from February 1st, we have been running the market for the real-time 15 and 5-minute market using this new logic of the nodal procurement enhanced calculation of the flexible ramping requirements. I would say what you're going to see through the rest of the presentation is a sample of some areas that we have analyzed. It's not all what we expect to analyze. One thing is that we also need a larger data sample to be able to draw conclusions. And one point doesn't make a trend. And I'm sure that we have an opportunity to assess how this is working over a longer period of time. February, I would say, relatively speaking, it's a good time to implement changes because it's relatively quiet. But on the downside, it's maybe too quiet to see stress conditions, how the FRP is going to be working. You have to bear in mind that the time of the year when we implemented this maybe not be the ripening conditions to see the full value of the FRP just because the demand is low. We have too much variability around this time of the year. The levels are relatively modest, so we have plenty of supply in the system. So I would encourage you to go through your glance and assess how things are working, to keep that reference in mind, because it is a relevant point to make when we have a limited amount of information to assess how so far it has been working. With that introduction, let me introduce now Hong from the forecasting team. He's going to be covering the first part of the discussion regarding. Check with Hong.
Thank you, Gilmore. Hello, everyone. This is Hong. I'm working in the short-term forecasting in the ISO. And mainly I will focus on the topic here is really too big. The enhancement, I'm more focused on the requirement. So can we go to next slide? Can you hear my voice? Is it reasonable enough? Too loud? Too? Okay. So then the ISO used ISO's energy market is in kind of in a sequential flavor. You have we have day-ahead market, RTPD, have RTD, all kinds of rock and all those stock. And so now our forecast is also in the sequential. So we have RTPD forecast for this particular FRP product. And then we have RTPD forecast with RTD forecast. So a natural question for when you are at RTPD, we need to kind of knowing what's going to happen, how much variable for RTD varying around RTPD. So ISO has a program used to estimate that how much uncertainty or variability from the RTPD to RTD, how much that variability is, uncertainty is. We use the histogram. Basically, we cut off a certain number of days, and then we see how much variability or uncertainty was happening in history. Then we cut 95 or 97.5 on top and 2.5 at the bottom. Then we get that natural estimate. It works fine over years. However, then some market participants and also ISO realize we can do a little better, and because we have at each time we have some weather information, we could incorporate the weather information to get that little accurate uncertainty requirement estimation. So can you move to slide 55? So then these slides showing the difference for all these mosaic histogram is you basically can be all the uncertainty can be represented in this graph. The red dots, the x-axis is the a whole day RTPD interval. We have 96, 24 hours. Each hour has 4 intervals. Then we have 96. The y-axis, x-axis is how much variability we have observed on that particular day in the EM area for the difference between the net load, the RTD forecast from the RTPD forecast. So the dots above 0 means RTD forecast net load is high. Dots below the 0 line, it means RTD net load forecast is low. So then this is for a day. We plot this. You can see a whole band behave kind of nicely in a band. So the requirement, the purple requirement is what we used to have is the histogram requirement we estimated historically, there could be like a river flow, could be go up, go down, but generally 95% should be, the river bank should be there. Then what is the mosaic requirement? It's little kind of curved and could be lower than the histogram, could be higher than the histogram. So how can we really show the evidence the blue line is doing a little better than the purple line? So that's what I'm going to trying to show. We kind of use the 4 different metrics to show the indeed the mosaic of all this struggle over years and incorporated discussion and debate and presented to market stakeholder meeting and all those. Then indeed we do have some advantages. Okay, so just bearing in mind is I just trying to really showing the blue line is a little better than the purple line. And in the back to the terminology we're going to use, we are going to see the mosaic is better than the histogram. In short term, M is better in 4 different measures or comparable in 4 different measures than the H. M stands for mosaic, here represented by the blue line, and H stands for histogram, represents the purple line. Now go back to 50, slide 50, thank you. Yeah, so how do we measure whether the requirement, the riverbank doing reasonable job to bound those kind of up and down red dots? So we just say, hey, how many times the river is still flowing on the in the river, not really spilled up outside the bank or spilled over the bank. So this is the coverage, the time, how much the observed the red dots still covered by either purple or blue lines. So this is coverage. The higher the coverage, the better the reliability is in terms of operational. But it's how you achieve that percentage, because I can build my river bank really wide, and then it basically I require higher requirements and to achieve the higher coverage. So this is not really one way measurement. We need 4 different measurements to really say, hey, you're not only have more coverage, you have more reasonable requirement, we need that. So the requirement is the width of the that river bank, the difference between the up and the how high we require in the FU up and how low in the FU up. And then we're going to answer the questions of the go to the 55. Okay, let me finish this one first. No, go back. I haven't not really answer question. Go back to 50. Yeah, thank you. Then the requirement should be reasonably comparable, and exceeding is the when you go outside the bank, the requirement, how much you really jumped out. So the smaller the exceeding, that means your requirement is more reasonable. And the last one is kind of combined of the combination of the the first 3 is the closeness, how close your requirement to the observed, the uncertainty. So then these 4 different measurements really represent the coverage, really represent the reliability, how good, how reasonable your requirement is. The requirement is represented, can be viewed as the cost. The large requirement, that means you have high operational cost, and exceeding means the risk, because no matter you cannot be 100% guaranteed how much risk you are going to take. If the exceeding is large, that means the risk of operational under this requirement is high. And the closeness means the margin, how requirement is, how your requirement distance between the requirement and observed uncertainty is. So how much operational margin we have, the narrow means is better for this operational, the grid operation. So now go to 55, we have a question. Thank you. Yeah, what is the question? Can somebody?
Hi, Hong, can you hear me? So, yes, the question we have, it was just a offline question, but for slide 55, the gold dashed dot lines are labeled quarterly threshold up and down. Are these related to statistical quartiles or something else?
This is the threshold to be updated quarterly to really prevent any the outliers, the data errors, and all those pi data error, finger, green finger, or whatever the finger that is, to prevent. So basically, we provide this threshold to the BAA, to market participants. All the requirement will be less than the threshold. So this is kind of assurance, the safety net. Thank you. Any other questions?
No more questions in queue.
Okay, now thank you. Can go back to 51. 51, you can go to 50. You said that the last one was 50. Yeah, so now we have the coverage requirement exceeding and closeness. The next 4 slides will go cover each of the coverage requirement exceeding at the BAA level, and the results are sort of uniform, but not exactly the same. The reason is that all these gains, performance gains, depends on the profiles of load, wind, solar for each BAA. If your BAA does not have any the solar or wind that much, the gain may not be there, and maybe it's a wash. So bear that in mind, this is not really the savings coming from the weather information is coming from the solar, because solar has a certain pattern. If you have tomorrow you're cloudy, then we should not have really much of variability. That's the in the layman language, then we should have less requirements. So it's the solar. Next is the wind to bring down the cost or requirements. Okay, go to next slide. Thank you. So now the Mosaic offer the less coverage, but it's comparable. So you can go through, I'll give you a few minutes, go through your own BAA, and we chosen the CISO. You can see the Mosaic, M stands for Mosaic, FRU, U stands for the up, FRD, flex ramp down, H, M. So all these are, so it's roughly the same, but a little less coverage. So it's comparable generally, and occasionally you can see some little higher one. The overall down for this February is lower than what I had expected. May relate to the some funny weather pattern or something, or some of the forecast generally on this month have the made the bias more towards the down of the on the load. So RTD load is lower than the RTPD. So but generally we should expect around 95, and so the up makes it reasonably good. The pattern is always there, generally holds true for all the BAAs. So go to next one. So now is coverage. Now this requirement. So you can see the requirement is the same, similar conclusion across all the BAAs. And generally, we achieved, when we say we, is Mosaic achieved the comparable coverage. Yes, we don't need that much requirement. So the average is average hour for each 15 minutes. We need less, 10% or so less of the requirement. That's a tremendous savings in terms of how much we require to achieve the same comparable coverage. So again, on the downside, the pattern may not really going to be presented for the other months. This month is a little closer. Generally, they also has roughly 10%, 5 to 10%, and here is a little narrow of in terms of savings. So, but on the up is what I have been reported in the simulation study to market stakeholder, market participant stakeholder meeting is 5 to 10% on the saving on the requirement. Okay, so you can view. I give 1 minute or so, or 30 seconds to view your own BAAs. So okay. So then you go to the next one is the exceeding. Even though we require, even though the Mosaic requirement is less, coverage is comparable, when it comes to exceeding, whether how much the water jumping outside the riverbank, and the Mosaic is jumping a little less, and on the both sides. And this conclusion is true for across all these BAAs, pretty much. And sometimes you have wash, depends on the, but generally that's the general conclusion. That's all this, and is really indicated the Mosaic is doing what we had designed to be better coverage. The blue is just slightly better, and the savings is good. Okay, so go to next. The closeness, that's the overall, how much distance between the requirement of the between the requirement and the uncertainty observed. The M is shorter. It's less overall, and even the conclusion is pretty much the same across all these. Some little ones may be a little higher of the of some, but generally since we are using the ISO, using the EM area, dynamic area, when you combine all these together to forming a EM area or dynamic area, the savings, the closeness, the exceeding, the coverage, so which all indicates Mosaic requirement is doing its job. And go to next slide. Okay, so this is a kind of graphical presentation of why the savings, why you can achieve that type of savings. We have these 3 different days selected on the February, and then you can see the purple line is less than, the blue line is less on the upside, is less than the purple line. Blue line is less than the blue line is less than the purple line. when we don't need that much. So you can see that happens on the time interval 70, and on the 30, that's the sun goes down, goes up, and that is generally we have the high requirements. Yet on the 30, no, go back. On the 55, you can see around the downside there, you can see on the interval 30, you can see when we need more, when it kind of may be jumping out, the requirements, the blue line is a little wider, so is the we require a little more, prepared a little more. Of course, there are some dots really want to jump on the both blue and the purple line, but then we blue line trying to do when we need it, we have more requirement. We don't need it, we can have some savings. So the next two slides is pretty much carrying the same story. Go to 56. You can see the gain of the savings on the 70s of less requirement, but on the between 65 when we tend to jumping more, no, on the interval 65 when they jumping more and then require more. And you can see that happen on the 30s, the time interval 30 around there is the same story. So it's kind of flexible in the requirements. We adjust to what weather information we might experience. And go to next one. The same is around the 70s there. And on the upside, you can see on the interval 30 there, I get a right little mark there is when we need more, then the requirement tends to, blue line tends to be getting higher, even though the red dots are jumping outside, but the distance of between the jumping out, the exceedance is much less. So basically, we are prepared better. And so these are all these examples happened in the February, and day in, day out, we have been seeing this flexibility and the savings and better prepared when we need it. So all indicate Mosaic has doing its job, and we are watching this, monitor this daily. Go to next slide. So this is kind of another what's the coverage and what's the requirement, and but this right now by itself not make too much sense. What I'm a little surprised this month is on the up left graph, the FRD coverage is a little low than what we expect. We should be around the 94-ish, around there, but then we'll see what's going to happen for next weather, is that weather related or not. So go to next. Okay, so that's the graph, how much the generally FRP requirement and what type of that's something was not. Go to next. This is the box the plot, and this is another box plot, and harmony profile. That's some. This is not in my presentation stack. Mainly, I will stop here and to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you.
If not, thank you.
I don't have any questions, right? Okay, let me resume now the presentation. Hong has covered specifically the performance of the calculation for the new approach using the mosaic and quantile logic. Let me move now into downstream systems. Once we have this requirement, you will see a series of metrics across the different areas of the market and interest that we have to monitor. And let me start first with this one, that is the trend of the requirement magnitude that we have, FRP in the upward or the downward direction, how the current values calculated with the new calculation are relative to the previous months in the historical calculation. And then, again, 1 month, 1 point of reference is potentially not enough to see the beauty or the implications, the benefits of this dramatic change that we have implemented. But it still starts to giving us some glimpse into how this is trending. The conclusion from this one is that you can see the requirements are relatively in the typical range. We don't see dramatic difference in the amount of requirements procured, clear or determined for the flexible ramping requirement. The monthly view may be too simplistic if we go into the daily approach. This is a daily distribution of the requirements utilized in the upward direction, and this is specifically for the CAISO balancing area. We do calculate the requirements for each individual balancing area that is utilized for test. After that, there is more complications in sophistication, how we account for that in real-time market. When you compare this 3-month period, you can see similar trends in terms of the magnitude. The maximum values that are the high end of the whiskers, you can see relatively in the same range. And the distribution that is captured by the box, we may see some more variability in variance in the requirement distribution. We also have is organized by the profile of the day, hourly profile. The next one. Okay, yeah. This one is the distribution on an hourly profile for the same 3 months, December, January, February. The main takeaway from here is that it appears that for the February condition with the new calculation, there is a better defined pattern of the distribution of the requirements. You can see that it kinds of follow the net load pattern. Still too preliminary to draw a strong conclusion on the trend. When we go into the downward direction, similar metrics, similar trends, we do see there is a higher requirement for the action, for the specifically, measured by the of the whiskers in this case. It be as high as about 2,000 megawatts. The outlier. We have the same distribution on our basis. Interesting enough, we see that the largest amount of requirements that we have in the early hours, the morning peak of the system. When we move one step further, now we go into the assessment of the resource efficiency evaluation, whether the capacity test, this flexible ramping test, performing in the same fashion or there has been any dramatic change specific to the requirement of the changes of the requirement that impacts or the flexible ramping test. And the that you have here is specifically for that test. We took the recent 3 months, including the implementation of February, just to see if there is any trend in any way. 3 months is still a very short window to see any trends with 1 month of the new calculation. It's much meaningful to see that, yeah, there are some failures in there, out of the ordinary in comparison to the. We have the same information organized by the time of the day. The largest frequency of the failures happen the day. That could make sense for the time of the year time frame. Shape and that profile starts to take a different trend as we get into the shoulder months and the same information for the downward direction. For that at your leisure by yourself. Let me just quickly walk through all the things. Now, when we move from the calculation of the test into the calculation of the requirements, then to the test, then we really go into the functioning of the real-time market. There are more sophistication. There is more sophistication in how we apply now the flexible ramping product requirements. The basic logic is that the nodal implementation, we run the test, we determine what entities, what balancing areas are going to pass the test. Those that pass the test are put together into one single wider balancing group that is called the passing group. And that is the requirement that is going to be enforced in the real-time market. If there is any entity that failed the test, that is going to stay on its own with its own requirement into the real-time market. It has to balance by itself, basically, now that it have failed the test. But the critical component here is that for those that pass the test, now we are going to enforce one single requirement for all those entities together. So the market is going to find that, yes, we have 17 entities making up one passing area. We calculate one requirement for this 17 footprint area, and that is the value that we're going to impose in the market, and that is the amount of reference that we have to clear and procure in the market to clear the flexible ramping capacity. This matrix tries to give you some sense of how we organize the following information. And basically, we are saying that depending on the column that you are looking at, you can see if, for instance, a passing group was composed of 18 balancing areas. The one that has the cross is a combination of two entities failing. We have 20 balancing areas. So if we have a passing group of 18 balancing areas, the ones listed with the cross means it was one combination that at some point on time in February didn't account for this as the passing group. So it would have been made up of everybody else, but let's say except Arizona and Nevada. The second group that with a cross is going to say that there was a point on time when the passing group was composed of 18 balancing areas, except Arizona and SRP, and so on. If you have another example now for passing group with 19 balancing areas, and you look at the first record, Arizona with a cross, meaning there was a point on time where the passing group was composed of 19 balancing areas, except Arizona, and so on. And you have that for the flexible ramping down, for the flexible ramping up. And the interesting, very curious outcome of this is that you can see that for the month, the majority of the entities passed the test, and that is somehow expected, but we didn't have more than 3 entities failing at the same time. So the groupings that you have is composed of either 17, 18, 19, or all entities passing. And that is relevant because when you go into understanding why or why not we have procured the amount that we needed, or why we have a zero or non-zero price, that is important context, because if you have a passing area composed of 19 balancing areas, and all of them can contribute to procure the FRP, there is a high likelihood that you are going to be able to meet that requirement, and potentially you have enough capacity that the price to be signaled is going to. When we go into how these permutations of the compositions of the passing area play for the month, here you have the frequency. The bars in yellow reflect the frequency of intervals in which all entities passed and made up the passing group. So everybody was in the same group. There was one single wider EIM area in which we apply the requirement of the flexible ramping product. The ones in green is when we have the passing area composed of 19 balancing areas. One of them was not part, but the majority were in, and so on. You can see that there is a small percentage for the orange one, for the passing group being made of 18 entities, meaning 2 only failed and were not accounted for those specific days. The blue one is not even visible. It's just so small. That gives you a sense of how frequently the entities are failing and how frequently we are building up this aggregated wider balancing area that is the one utilized to enforce in the market to procure the FRP. Now, there is a series of metrics. I don't expect to go into every single one. They are conveying the same information for different references, either for the EIM area or for the CAISO area or in some type of passing area fashion. So for this one, we are accounting for the trends when we account for all the areas of the Western energy imbalance market. We have to make this, trying to make it apples to apples, because before February, we didn't have the concept of the passing areas. It was only the system-wide area or the individual areas. But now we have this composition of the passing areas, so you cannot compare any of the passing areas against the old-fashioned all EIM areas. So we try to put all in the same context. And the trends are organized either by the contribution of each area into the total EIM area, and also organized by month in an hourly profile. You can see over time how the composition of who is providing the FRP is, but also through the time of the day, what entities are procuring that capacity. And if you have a better resolution on your computer, you may see that, yes, there is a change after the implementation of the nodal procurement starting on February 1st, where effectively that portion in green becomes smaller and is substituted with this yellowish color. And we can see more granularity later on, but there is a change in the composition of the procurement of the FRP simply because of the new structure of how we enforce the requirement. And let me go into one more and I will skip the subsequent ones. This one is the same information, but it's organized by the type of resources that are procuring FRP. The previous one was by balancing area, in what area of the system that procurement was met. This one is what type of resource, hydro, gas, storage, PR, etc., are meeting the requirement. And here you can see that there is still also a meaningful change. We can see that starting on February, the composition of, among the different technologies changed. We are going from heavy green into now more yellowish color, meaning which one is the yellow one. But you can see that there is a switch in what type of resources are procuring the FRP before and after the February 1st implementation. And in the lower part, you can see the same information organized by month, but also by the time of the day, just to see at what time of the day, what type of resource is procuring or backing up the FRP. And we can see, for instance, in February, there was a fair increase of FRP being procured from hydro resources. That was not the case for the previous 2 months. See a reduction, storage resources from December and January going into the February timeframe. So there is a swapping of resources providing that FRP. I will skip this one. It's exactly the same structure. In this case, we are going for the downward direction. And we have specific to the CAISO. And here is let me just highlight something here because it's quite obvious something happened for CAISO specifically. There is a context for this. Prior to February, the logic that we have back in framework was such that implemented an enhancement to ensure that the CAISO area had a minimum requirement to procure. Because the general issue that we tackled in 2019 is that by the way how we account for the credit and the net import capability coming from other balancing areas, effectively the CAISO may have a net requirement of 0 because it could just basically rely on the transfer capabilities to meet its own requirement. Part of the solution was to impose a minimum requirement that regardless of the transfer capability among other areas, the CAISO on its own has to procure a minimum requirement. With the nodal implementation, the concept of the passing group, that is no longer in place. And what you can see here is that now the CAISO is generally part of the passing group, part of the 17, 18, 19 balancing areas. And now that requirement can be procured from anywhere of these 17, 18, 19 balancing areas. Naturally, CAISO doesn't have to procure a minimum requirement anymore, and that requirement is optimally allocated across that wider balancing passing group area. The result is that starting with the nodal procurement, CAISO procurement has reduced significantly, and you can see that in these trends for both the daily trend or the hourly trend. And that is a factor to understand the nuances and the logic behind. We also have the same metrics when it applies to the passing group. These are exactly the same. Now, we cannot put metrics for this specific reference prior to February because prior to February, we didn't have any passing group concept. This only applies to February. Now, let me move into prices. One of the expectations is that once you properly account for the limitations to procure FRP, prices are going to be a good signal of how that procurement is taking place. Here you have a scatter plot reflecting the prices that happen for FRU, flexible ramping in the upward direction, for each of the last 3 months, including February with the new logic, organized by an hourly profile. And you can see for February, the prices have been relatively low, lower than even December and January when we reached the upper bound of the $247. There are many prices still in the range of 0 prices, and they are just all clustered in this horizontal line at the level. There are some non-zero prices. When you go into the downward direction, it's not dramatically different. We see higher prices than the previous 2 months, but still quite scattered across the whole month, across the entire day. You want to see this in a more summarized fashion. We have this trend over the month, just the total count, the intervals where we have non-zero prices. These are organized in different price ranges, just to see how high, how low the prices have been. And the striking piece here is that when you see the total frequency of intervals with 0 prices or non-zero prices, it's pretty small. It's even smaller than the previous months. And that obviously raises a few questions as to why under the nodal procurement, this is the outcome that we see. When we look into the real-time market, that is not that different. You see the relative height of the y-axis is still a fraction of a percent. Largely 0 prices for the month of February. There are some price activity in February in the range of $200 all the way up to actually $10. Some people may wonder, how can it be that now we have negative prices for FRP? Because you can see that the first 2 means, the light blue and orange, are indeed affecting negative prices between $25. There is a gray one that is for 0 to minus $10. That has to do with the way now we clear the market. Shadow price of the FRP requirement is only one of the components that make up the final nodal price of FRP. Still, there is this question. It's an obvious question. Why the majority of the intervals that we have seen so far in February are showing a price of 0? There are different factors that I would like to put in context. And the first one is that the concept of the passing area on its own gives us this wider footprint in which we can procure requirements. Yes, we enforce constraints, and if they are cheapest area. And in some cases, if the capacity is there, the diversity is there, of supply to be a requirement. Effectively, the price is zero because there is. Another factor to consider is that with the implementation of the node procurement, we are going with the training wheels. This is a huge switch in the paradigm, and we are introducing now the congestion component to the procurement of FRP. What we have done is that this is brand new to everybody, including the operators that have the transmission system. So what we have done is going in a scale approach. The implementation that we have for February 1st has the full functionality of nodal procurement, but the set of transmission constraints that we are enforcing is limited set. We want to ensure that we clean up any issues that we find, any areas that we identify. Once we have that cleaner and we have experience gained by exercising this subset of constraints, we can start adding more constraints until full-blown of the transmission constraints. I also mentioned earlier the time of the year also matters. The low levels of demand, we tend to have sufficient supply. Therefore, the conditions to have enough supply to meet the requirement is going to be there. That is going to result effectively. That should be changing as we transition into the shoulder months and we go to the summer conditions. And last but not least, there is a factor to consider here, and a reminder that the real-time FRP model is based on opportunity cost. There is no bids effectively in place to express the willingness to procure that service. It's purely based on opportunity cost, and that opportunity cost is going to arise only when the conditions are ripe. There is a resource that is limited that has to back up from energy to be able to procure FRP, and that is how the price differential between the clear price is going to set that opportunity cost that becomes the shadow price of the FRP procure. If we have enough supply from this wide pool of resources composed from 18, 17, 19, or 20 balancing areas, most likely we have sufficient supply across the footprint to be able to procure. What else is happening on this? I indicated that we are enforcing the nodal model that is already in place. We have effectively one reference price that would be derived from meeting the requirement of the FRP, and that is going to be compounded with the element of the congestion. So you may have two components, like the system wide reference price, but also the congestion management component. And that is to ensure that we are going to be able to have a feasible procurement of FRP if that FRP capacity has to be deployed. What else we have? Just to go a little bit deeper into the explanation of what constraints we are currently enforcing. When we went live on February 1st, we start the nodal procurement enforcing a subset of transmission constraints. We have, generally speaking, three sets of transmission constraints in the system. Flow-based transmission constraints. This can be base flow gates that reflect like a typical transmission line rating. We have also contingency flow gates that reflect the condition to be N-1 secure. And we also have nomograms that could be to address more complex contingencies or security conditions. Right now, we are currently enforcing only the subset of base flow gates. We are not enforcing contingency and nomograms. We are finalizing the testing, the functionality for the nomogram. That is going to come next. And after that, we have to assess the needs for the enforcement of contingency flow gates. And that is giving us the time, the space to gain the experience in operating with the FRP. Again, identify any issues that we may have in the operation of this new product. When we go into the congestion of the system, this is just to give you a sense of how much congestion we have at this time of the year. This doesn't measure the severity of the congestion, neither the cost of the congestion. It's just telling you how frequently different constraints are binding, are congested in the system. It's just a simple count of different constraints. And this is across the three types of flow-based constraints: base flow gates, contingency, and nomograms. And this obviously is based on energy, because for FRP, it's only the base flow gates. And not surprisingly, the majority of the congestion observed in the system happens during the summer time frame. That is when we see the majority of the congestion happen in the system, have high levels of demand that has to flow through the system and is more easily to hit the transmission limitations. If you put the reference for how that played for February, you can see that the dark blue is the base flow gates. That is a tiny portion. The majority of the constraints for February for energy were indeed contingencies. If you take in reference what was enforced for FRP, it would be the tiny portion in the dark blue. If we expand this across the entire EIM footprint, this gives you a sense how many constraints we have across the different balancing areas, including the CAISO. If there is a specific area not listed here, basically it has nothing. There has no constraints binding at all. And the count obviously gives you the relative sense of the size of the different areas. Number one is CAISO. It has over 100, almost 200 different set of constraints binding in the month of September, during the midst of the most critical period of the year. That could be as low as somewhere in the 40s in parts of the year. The next one, count-wise, could be anywhere between Arizona and Pac East that may have a handful of constraints in binding, anywhere between 4 to 6 constraints. And then you can go through the different constraints. This is just giving you a sense of how many flow-based internal constraints are typically congested across the different balancing areas that make up the Western energy market right now in the real time. Let me go very quickly. I think we are over time with the prices, just to give you a sense of how the prices are being formed. We just pick some sample cases, specific intervals to give you a sense of why the price is 0 or why the price is the value that it is. In this case, we have one instance of February 24th, already 19, for the 15-minute mark. We have a passing group composed of effectively 19 balancing areas except BPA. Everybody is in the same passing area. We can get procurement anywhere in these 19 areas. We have a requirement of over 1,000 megawatts that was easily met with the resources available from these 19 areas. If we are able to meet all the requirements, effectively, the demand curve, that is what the price for trigger, right? Because that triggers only have to tax the requirement when we are not able to meet the requirement. If we are able to meet all the requirement, effectively the price is going to be 0. That is together with the fact that there is no opportunity cost, that there is no resource that has to be a cap energy to be able to procure. Here we have the profile of the procurement FRP from 5 different balancing areas by the type of sources that are providing that. Effectively, we got the $1,000 megawatt requirement met 5 different areas across 7 different types of technology. We have the breakdown. So it's quite a spread. 5 areas. And this is just 5 out of the 19 balancing areas modeled together to the requirement. One more, we have another case of February 24. This is an RTD case where we actually have a non-zero price. Indeed, we have nodal prices for FRP. Some resources that have different prices for FRP, showing the nodal nature of the. We just pick one resource to show up how the nodal price of FRP, about $19.3, was composed. Here we have the elements. We have this resource procuring 32 megawatts. So nodal price for FRP. That price was composed of two elements. One, the system reference price, $100.4, the shadow price of the constraint. The second part was the congestion component. There was one internal KAISO congestion, the Mirage, and that specific resource, given its location, has a shear factor of 0.% Sorry, this is not percent. This is the magnitude. The congestion component for the FRU about $119.7. When the nodal FRP come in place, effectively is going to keeping the direction in this case. So the congestion component outsets or the system-wide reference price of $100, and the net price becomes $9. That is how the two components now nodal price to come. What else we have here? There are some areas that we're still analyzing, and we will report on that. There is one business practice change. We are participants regarding one implication that now we have after it. That is that there is an implication specifically for the first interval of each hour that relies now on the test result of the second pass, the T-55. Historically, the T-40 has been the reference to determine whether an entity passed or failed the test. With the formulation that we have for the nodal procurement, and we switch one interval forward, now the only way to know the information of the test on time for that and run for that interval, the first interval of the hour, has to be relying now on the it's a limitation of how soon you can get information. There are other areas that we have exploring. We have seen, for instance, very tiny negative prices regarding the FRP. That has to do with some logic how we model the cost of the transfers. We have been rounding those prices basically to zero because it's just a very tiny and there are also some considerations we are doing for energy limited resources. In some cases, we have seen that the FRP is some resources that may be energy limited, and obviously that may have implications effectively how much FRP can carry for that specific matter. There are a couple of settlements metrics that I'm going to skip. These are at your disposal. And the second whole part of the presentation, these are the standard metrics that we have. You can go through those if you have any questions. And thank you for the time. I don't know if we have any questions, Brenda.
We do have a question from Callie Wells. Let's go ahead, silence and unmute her line.
Hey, Guillermo, it's Callie Wells with WPTF. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you to you and your team and anyone else who was involved in pulling this data together in such a short amount of time. There's a lot of interesting trends and data that you have in these slides. So I'm sure I'll have more questions later, but I just wanted to say thank you. So I know we're running out of time, so I just have I'll just kind of limit my questions to a few of them. Back on slide 73, when you were showing procurement by resource type, there is a resource type that was somewhat unfamiliar to me. It's GNRC. Is that is that for generic, or what exactly is a GNRC resource type?
Yeah, this is one type of resource that we model for the EIM areas. It's an aggregated resource.
Okay, gotcha. That's why it wasn't that familiar to me.
Yes.
Okay, that makes sense. And then on slide 82 and 83, when you showed the nodal prices, just kind of the distribution of them, is that only for the passing group, or does that include the passing group and non-passing groups?
That's a good question. I would believe it includes every single price regardless.
Okay. That makes sense. Yeah, I'd be curious that, obviously not now, but at a later time, if you're seeing any difference in pricing trends, I suspect you would, but between passing groups and the non-passing groups. And then the last question, actually two more quick questions. So on the slide where you showed how many internal constraints are binding by the different BAAs, you had just kind of the count of constraints. I've always been curious if you can throw that into a percentage of total constraints that are modeled, because obviously there's a stark difference between the CAISO numbers and the EIM and the non-CAISO EIM BAAs. But I'm curious, like, if one of the BAAs is showing only 6 binding constraints, is that 6 out of 10 or is that 6 out of 100 that were modeled? It'd be useful just to kind of quantify that.
Yeah.
Okay, and then one last, and then I'll let anyone else chime in here. On one of those last slides, you were going through how the prices are set nodally, and I noticed there was a couple nodal prices that were 0, even though the shadow price was non-zero. Am I to assume correctly that for those nodes, the congestion component exactly offset the shadow price?
Yes, we have seen some of those cases.
A congestion component, but it just happens to exactly offset the shadow price?
Yes, I think there is one case, at least from February 24th, I believe, where this interplay happens, and it's an interplay between congestion and the opportunity cost of the resource, and in the end, the price is 0. That potentially may happen.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I understood what was going on there. Okay, that's all the questions I have for now. Again, really appreciate you guys throwing that data together. I'm sure I'll reach out with more questions as I digest it all.
Good.
Okay, so we are running kind of close behind time. So I know I see Raul. Raul, if you have a quick question, that'll be great. But if not, send it through chat and we could go ahead and have the team review it. So yeah, sure. Okay, but Raul, go first.
Thank you.
Okay, I see your hand down. Let's go ahead. Go, Brian.
Hey, Guillermo, Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. Can you qualitatively describe what the meaning of a negative FRP price is? I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that concept.
Yeah. This all goes back to the construct of the prices, right? You have more than one component. Right. So you have 2 dimensions of the prices. One is the congestion component, and the other one is the opportunity cost of the resource that is going to effectively set the price. So you can think in this way. If you have an opportunity cost, that means our resource is able to set the price because it has to move generation to be able to accommodate the FRP. Is for an opportunity. That could be like $5, just for example. If that resource at the same time is competing because of against congestion, that is any movement that it makes in regards to that opportunity cost for FRP is also going to impact the price of the congestion. So that resource is going to now signal these 2 conditions. Effectively, are going to end up in a composition that at the end gives you the right opportunity for that resource. How you come with that $5, maybe because you have now a flexible, a requirement price that is minus $100 with a component that is 105. Because these 2 are somehow interacting now. The net price is the $5 that is effectively the opportunity cost of the resource.
If a resource that's been awarded FRP has a negative price, does that mean that they pay to provide FRP?
Let's clarify because this is important. We do not expect, well, most of the time, generally speaking, we don't expect to have negative nodal prices for FRP for resources procuring FRP. There may be a case, and we were running through these potentially scenarios and trying to test for conditions for this to happen for implementation, that if you look at holistically energy plus FRP, the resource still is made whole properly. How you decompose that part into the energy and the FRP may end up in a price that negative price still makes sense when you holistically. But if you just put that extreme case aside, generally speaking, there shouldn't be a negative price for a source that has requirement procured.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to stop here. Thank you.
Make sure, Jillian, we can hear you.
Hey, Brenda, how are you?
I'm good. Let's go ahead and kick things off if you're policy update.
Super. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the presenters, and thank you for the opportunity to give this policy update. Thanks also to the folks in the room. Sorry I couldn't be there in person with you today. I think I can get through this pretty quickly and make up for a little bit of well-spent time on more technical issues. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Great. As usual, this section of the presentation is just an update on ongoing initiatives. So just to jump right in, we have interconnection process enhancements ongoing. That's obviously an initiative that keeps on giving. These are enhancements to address queue overload and just focusing on aligning the interconnection process with LSD procurement processes. So we've had phase 1 and phase 2 approved in 2022, and IPE, as it's affectionately known, interconnection process enhancements 2023 is targeted to go in short order to the board in May for approval. Okay, all right, we can go to the next slide. This slide is in place of the recently completed initiative on greenhouse gas coordination with the state of Washington, and those limited changes were approved at the board in December, board and governing body in December. But I wanted to include this slide here really as a placeholder. This is not an actual policy initiative, yet definitely warrants mention because it's going to take up some time of stakeholders and certainly of staff. It came out of the EDAM process largely. In particular, the stakeholders involved in the EDAM process requested further clarity and materials to help understand the market rules and operational details of GHG incorporation in CAISO markets and just generally and across the West. So I think this is here to announce a series of workshops that I think will really help participants participate more fully in the policy development going forward as it pertains to greenhouse gas stuff. So just to cut to the chase, we are announcing 2 series of workshops. The first over the summer, and again, as I just mentioned, those will really focus on like really the basics, understanding, so that everybody is really grounded in the basics of how GHG markets work, and in particular with the ISO and the WEIM and the potential and the EDAM going forward. So that will be the first series, May through September, like I said, over the summer. And then beyond that, really thinking about how that will play into potential initiatives to either incorporate, to both incorporate and refine GHG in the EDAM and the WEIM. I mean, I think it's important to note here that in that second set of workshops in particular, we'll be considering, you know, the policy initiatives in other Western states. Oregon and Washington in particular have evolving regulatory processes with respect to GHG, and we'll really need to continue discussions around the interplay of those. These workshops are designed to be the place for those discussions. So again, it's not a policy update. I'm just taking a little bit of real estate to do a plug for these upcoming workshops, and wanted to make sure that they were on everybody's radar. Of course, we'll be getting the word out in other venues as well, but just wanted to take a few moments to talk through that. We can go to the next slide. Okay, So WEIM RSE, Resource Efficiency Evaluation, the Enhancements Phase 2 initiative went to the board in December, so we're glad to have that completed. And, you know, although we anticipate RSE Enhancements Phase 3 in the future, this initiative is completed for now, so we will probably won't see this slide the next time we do this update, probably. Okay, we can go forward. Can we go forward one slide? Thank you so much. Okay, so energy storage enhancement, again, went to the board in December. Another huge check mark, getting stuff done. And we're working on the tariff language. The revised draft tariff language was posted March 15th. So that is indicative that we'll be expecting a FERC filing soon. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Super. Minimum state of charge constraint extension. This is slated to go to the board in just a couple weeks here in March. And this is a pretty quick stakeholder initiative intended to extend the minimum state of charge constraint in very limited circumstances. And that, as you may have noted in the final iteration of the paper, is only intended to, we only intend to ask for to extend our ability to impose that constraint through September 30th of this year. So it's a very limited extension of that already in place constraint and gives us a little stopgap due to the fact that the more robust solution is still in the implementation phase. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay, so ancillary service state of charge constraint was an expedited initiative in response to, observed market outcomes that we felt we needed to address on a quick basis. And so that has already been filed with FERC, and we expect that if there are any additional changes needed, we will go through a stakeholder process on that. At this time, we're looking at putting out an issue paper, a straw proposal in the next 2 to 3 months to delineate what we expect would be any additional changes needed in response to the observed market outcomes. Okay, all right, one more slide. Forward, thank you so much. Okay, CPM, Capacity Procurement Mechanism Track 1, is also on target to go to the March ISO board meeting. That one is ISO decisional only. So we can look forward to, working towards implementing the various elements of that initiative soon. Go one slide forward. Thank you. Okay, day-ahead market enhancements, a big one, right? So the scope of this is co-optimizing supply and IFM based on both demand and imbalance reserve product needs, as well as RUC improvements. A lot of activity here. So this is where we're all spending our time. In fact, we just had an MSC, Market Surveillance Committee meeting on March 10th. We are looking toward getting this initiative to the board in May of this year. But stay tuned for lots of activity on day-ahead market enhancements. We can go forward one more slide, please. Thank you. EDAM, Extended Day Ahead Market, has been board and WEIM governing body approved. And we're working diligently internally on the tariff language for that. So we're targeting a July tariff filing. Be on the lookout for tariff review calls and that filing there in July. Okay, one more slide forward, please. Okay, transmission services and market scheduling priorities. The initiative more affectionately known as Wheeling was approved also in February at the board and WEIM governing body sessions, and tariff language is forthcoming, although the schedule is not quite as set as it is on the EDAM, but these are obviously all very interrelated, so I think you can expect to see activity in that regard coming soon. We can go to the next slide. Price formation enhancements. So as you know, this is the scope of the price formation enhancements initiative is divided into two phases. The first being focused on scarcity pricing, fast start pricing, and market power mitigation. In addition, as not listed here, in addition to the extension of the horizon for the FlexiRamp product. And then in phase two, being more focused on big cost recovery and multi-interval optimization issues. So this work on this continues. It has maybe taken a little bit of not a pause, I wouldn't say a pause, but really trying to use the workshops to reach out to stakeholders and incorporate feedback from those, as well as get stakeholders, engaged and up to speed on sort of technical issues. So we're working with those workshops. In fact, we have one coming up on March 20th, but look forward nonetheless to having a straw proposal out on the first phase of price formation enhancements in Q2. So in the next, again, 2 to 3 months. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, market parameter changes enhancements. This one Abhishek referred to earlier. This is related to CRR settlements. So just to kind of, connect the thread there. This is the initiative that we believe is going to make a significant improvement in settlements for CRRs as we lower the shift factor threshold for aggregated trading pricing locations, basically DLAPs and trading hubs within the ISO BAA. And then other changes associated with market parameter change enhancements would be changing the procedure for changing the scheduling run priority prices used in the ISO market. This is going to the board in March, so all queued up and ready to go, and we'll look forward to dropping this slide off. Also, we have quite a few things going in March, so there'll be a new batch of slides for the next Market Performance and Planning Forum. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay. A new initiative, I mean, it is more than new. I think we're still sort of hatching it in the next few days, but basically we have an initiative forthcoming to address the California ISO as a balancing authority area participation rules for, being in the extended day ahead market. So again, this is brand new. I haven't even listed a decisional classification here, but basically you can expect to see in the next few days, specifically I think March 20th, a market notice that will both launch the initiative and provide, the scope of it and the schedule going forward. And just a preview into that schedule, we'll have a stakeholder workshop on April 5th to kick that off. So please mark your calendars for that. We can go to the next slide. Great. This is my last slide. Generation deliverability methodology review, occasionally known as generation deliverability challenges, is a brand new initiative. We had an update paper posted on December 12th, but we're expecting an issue paper this month with a stakeholder meeting next month to respond to industry concerns about access to deliverability for resources that really want to compete in the load serving entity procurement processes, and recognizing that there are some sticking points there. Want to figure out what those sticking points are and then make a plan going forward. So this is a newly launched initiative, just getting started here. Brenda, I hope I zipped through those slides quickly and gained us back a little bit of time, but I do want to pause and see if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Jillian. So we are running a little bit behind schedule, so we want to go ahead and move to the next topic. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to submit them to the ISO stakeholder affairs at kaizo.com or send it through chat from now before the end of the meeting, and we'll go ahead and take those two back to Jillian to answer. But I don't see any on queue, so we can go ahead and have Trang Vo do the next few slides.
Okay. Thank you, Brenda. Can you hear me okay? Okay, how about now? All right, great. Thank you everyone for being here and joining us today. I'm Trang Vo from the PMO. So I had the pleasure of speaking to some of you at the Release User Group last Tuesday, and I also have a Release User Group forum coming up next Tuesday. So in the interest of time, I will briefly cover just the highlights and changes since the last Release User Group on Tuesday, and then if there are any questions, then I'll take those at the end. And for a more thorough discussion of the release plan update, I do invite you to join the Release User Group on Tuesday, March 21st. That is on the public. Forward to talking to those who can join that forum. Right. So the training information is out there and available on the website, so I won't go over detail. And for the release plan summary, going to skip through that. There are material changes there, but just some minor adjustments that we'll cover in the individual slides. All right, so the update for our WEIM Spring 2023 release is that we did file our readiness certification for all 3 entities on March 3rd, 2023. So with that filing, we certified our for the market simulation and parallel operations activities to activate those 3 entities on. I'll move on to our independent initiatives, and now we have the remainder from last year. So the one update here is that shared ramping constraint, which was projected for availability and production in March of 2020, is now being been identified to need additional testing and work. So to ensure quality of that initiative prior to introducing that and making production, we are to take our time with those activities as well as include a market simulation period. And so with that, I've removed the March target for that and designated that as independent 2023. No changes to the ETSR detail screen ETA. Moving forward to our more tentative releases, we've made a lot of progress in the implementation planning of these and to highlight some of those changes there. And these build upon some of the activities that Jillian highlighted in the policy update. So you'll see some alignment between materials that are data that was presented by Jillian and into the implementation that again just highlights the coordination between our for. Okay. As usual, we'll start with the overview. So what you'll see in bold are the activities or updates since the last week date. So starting with the board, you'll see that day-ahead market enhancements, we did identify, as Jillian mentioned, a target May board. And so that will be 17th decision for. Onto the tariff activities and updates since the last RUG. For energy storage enhancements, phase 1, track 1 for AS and ED, we did have published a revised draft tariff language. It's available for your comments. And then also in tariff activities, last Tuesday, we did publish the final revised draft tariff language for RSEE as well. And then one other update on the tariff, as Jillian mentioned, is for the EDAM target to file tariff in July. We have no changes to the BRSs at this point, but I'd like to give folks a heads up that energy storage enhancement, as we continued with our internal requirements, revised external publications and do have some revisions to the energy storage BRS that are to publish next week, targeting prior to the RUG by Tuesday. Onto the settlements deliverables, the updated our draft config guide yesterday for all 4 of those projects that are listed, the changes, and our second draft milestone for settlements, and that is now targeted for the April 3rd or 10th. To the settlements effective dates or production activation. Go ahead and forward dates here, just a designation for the applications that anticipate to have tech spec changes for those that are to make changes to connect to these. Those will have specification site. And then the next couple of slides highlight the content that we've RUG and the TUG expected high API changes for each system across the changes there. And then for each of the summer initiatives, you will now see an individual milestone slide that goes into a little bit more detail about what other deliverables to expect for each of those initiatives. I won't go over that in detail. I covered changes at high-level release matrix, but slides are posted and available, so those that are interested can review these and then prepare any questions and either send them to me or Tuesday and then ask questions and have a discussion there. SOC, G storage, CE, resources 2C with their and RIMS components. And then we have our CRR updates. So this is a multi-year implementation, 2023. And so it does have the milestones listed here that have not changed, but again, I wanted to let folks know that the next CPG is on March 22nd. What we have coming up before that is going to be the BRS revision planned to publish by tomorrow, as well as the draft deployment plan to publish by tomorrow. And those 2 items, the BRS revision and the draft question at the next CPG, March 22nd. So please tune into that if this impacts you if you're interested. And again, this is just a reiteration of that takes me to the end of the brief release update. So are there any questions or comments? Yes.
Brian Thaker with Middle River. Don't know if this question is for you or Jillian, but either one can answer. Both of you alluded to EDAM tariff coming out, targeting a July filing. Any idea when the first tranche of tariff language is going to get released?
I personally don't have. I'd like to invite Jillian to. Right. Still there.
Should have asked her. Thanks.
It's okay. If she joins, then that's great. Otherwise, I will take that off and follow up with her too, Brian, and then we can reach out to you offline. Get a response now. Any other questions or comments? Thanks. Okay. Well, it was. I'm happy to talk to you and look forward to. Thanks, Brenda.
Okay, so that brings us to the last of our slides. So just a reminder, the slides are updated. We do have calendars available to view all those meetings that we have, and some of them will be happening in person. Like next week on Monday, we have the price formation meeting. And then if you do have any questions, please submit a city ticket entitled Market Performance and Planning Forum, or send us an email through to ISO Stakeholders Affairs at kaizo.com. We did get a few chat questions, so please be patient. We will get back to you as soon as possible. If not, we look forward to seeing you at the next upcoming Market Performance Planning Forum on June 15th. Thank you, everyone. And Silas, you can go ahead and close the meeting. Thank you.